Welcome back. So last time, of course, we did the basics of argument diagramming, identifying premises and conclusions. And of course, that's the basics of an argument, is that it has a premise and it has a conclusion. So one idea being presented as a reason for believing another idea. And we tried to tease out the idea of validity from truth. So usually, intuitively, when a person's presented with an argument, they ask themselves, are all of these things true? And if all of them are true, then you say, aha, that's a good argument. But here we're trying to separate the property of being composed of true sentences. So you can have a string of all true sentences that are nonetheless not a valid argument. Recall that arguments are either valid or invalid. Arguments are not true or false. Only the statements that make up arguments can be true or false. So that was the basic idea last time, just sort of getting those essential terms on the table, getting the basic idea of an argument, of validity, and of soundness. Soundness is, of course, validity plus truth. So the validity of the argument plus the fact that its premises are true are what tell you it's sound. So that was last time. And we just did the most basic elements of argument diagramming, and today we're going to take it one step further. So we're going to start to see not just that there are premises and a conclusion, but to start to pick apart how arguments are actually structured, so the different ways in which premises can support a conclusion. So we'll do that. We'll do and definitions, of course. So it's basically two separate skill sets that we're going to do today. Argument mapping 2, taking the argument mapping stuff one step further, and we'll keep taking it step after step until you're dealing with full-blown, complex, like normal level arguments. And we'll also be talking about definitions. So of course the elements of an argument are statements, and if you don't know what the words in a statement mean, then you don't know what the statement says. So talking about the different ways in which you can define words. We'll look at 3 different sort of styles of definition, and each style of definition has different standards by which it needs to be judged. So if you don't know how somebody's defining a term, as in what of these 3 strategies, reportive, stipulative, or essentialist definitions they're using, then you don't know whether they've defined it properly or not. So we'll talk about the 3 ways that you can define a term, or at least these 3 ways, maybe there are others. And then we'll talk about what are called analytic and synthetic statements. So that's statements that are either true simply but in terms of the definition of the word, or statements that are not true simply in terms of the definition of the word. That's an analytic statement. If it's analytic, it's true you'll know that it's true just by knowing how the words are being used. And it's synthetic in case you have to actually go out into the world and check whether it's true or not. Okay. So those are the basic ideas, and they basically break down into second level argument mapping and evaluating definitions. And we'll use the evaluating definition stuff to do a little bit of evaluating whether a statement is analytic or synthetic. Okay? Any questions about course mechanics? Does the quiz now have questions in their complete form? Yes or no questions? Yes, okay. So I'm seeing at least one person nod their head. So, okay, good. Good. All right. Let's get into it then. So let's start with the argument mapping stuff. This is really like the core skill that we need you to get in the first half of the class, is getting this argument diagramming stuff. So we're going to do it every week. It's going to get repetitive. You will get annoyed with having to do all this argument mapping, but it's totally worth it, I promise you. Because if you get this skill, you'll be able to look at something that looks like just a mess of words and be able to see a kind of implicit structure, a structure that's hidden unless you learn the skill of seeing it. So we're going to spend a lot of time on argument mapping. Here's step 2. Right, so the first time we just did a premise leading to a conclusion. Today we're going to learn to distinguish 2 different ways in which premises might be related to a conclusion. They might be dependent reasons for believing the conclusion, or they might be independent reasons for believing the conclusion. So in the case of dependent relation, these 2 premises do not lend support to the conclusion unless both are true. Right? So they both have to be true for either of them to support the conclusion. With independent arguments, this premise supports the conclusion, and this premise supports the conclusion, and neither one has to be, so this one doesn't have to be true for this one to have a logical relationship. So the logical relationship of this premise does not depend on the truth of this premise, and vice versa, of course. Okay, so if that's abstract, don't worry. We'll get into a bunch of examples which should make it clear. But those are basically the two kinds of relationships that premises can have to conclusions or to other premises. There was a bit of confusion last week about what counts as a premise and what counts as a conclusion. I'm going to, just for the sake of this class, and it's purely conventional, let's call anything that's not the final conclusion a premise. So if there's another premise leading to a premise, they're both just premises. Okay, so don't call them subconclusions, just call them premises. Right? There's no reason for that other than just so that we all do the same thing. You could call these, like if there's a premise that is offered as a reason to believe another premise, you could call the middle premise a conclusion itself or a subconclusion, but let's just call only the final thing in the argument the conclusion, and then everything else premise. Is that all right? All right, so premises can be related to other premises or to conclusions in basically just these two ways. And the goal right now is to get you to the point where you can identify when it's one way and when it's the other. Right? And then as we move on to complex argument diagrams, there will be a variety of different sort of pieces of the argument, and they'll all be related. They'll still all be related only in one of these two ways, however. Right? So you just sort of like iterate this. So there can be two dependent reasons for a premise, which is an independent reason for a conclusion, or there could be two independent reasons for like one of these premises, which combined with another premise is a dependent reason for the conclusion, and so on. So we'll just build up more and more complex argument structures, but we're only going to use these two ways. So you can either have like just one premise leading to a conclusion, or you can have more than one independently or more than one dependently, and that's it. So those are the elements out of which all complex argument diagrams will be built. Yeah, question?
So is that the complete syntax for the rest of the course, essentially? Like, is there any new notation, or is that it essentially?
That's pretty much it. I mean, so the question is that the complete syntax for the rest of the course? Yeah, that's pretty much, I mean, I'll introduce a few other sort of assorted formalisms because there's a bunch of deductively valid argument structures that you should know. But in terms of argument mapping, this is really it. It doesn't get much more complicated than that, other than taking instances of these and building them into more complex structures. I hope that sounds easy. It should start off fairly easy, and we'll gradually ramp it up to where it's hard. So let's look first at independent reasons. So a situation where two premises are independent reasons for believing the conclusion, where the logical relationship between one premise does not depend on the truth of the other premise. All right, so the conclusion is you are a bad roommate. And here are two independent reasons for believing that. One is you don't clean your dishes, and the other is that you haven't paid your rent. So the test, well, one way of testing whether something is an independent reason for a conclusion is to imagine that the other thing isn't true. So imagine that your roommate has paid their rent. So this is false. Now ask yourself, is this still a reason to believe the conclusion? Right? So if they've only committed the crime of not cleaning their dishes, does that still lead you to think this conclusion is more likely? And yes, it should. Yes, it should. Right? Similarly, suppose they do clean their dishes, but they're not paying their rent. That should, independently of whether they're cleaning their dishes, raise the likelihood in your mind of the truth of this proposition that they're a bad roommate. Right? Right. So that should be fairly straightforward, right? So, yeah, question?
Each of them have like their own strength, though. So like saying you haven't paid your rent is a much more convincing argument.
Yes. Yes. So yes, each of these, the logical relationship between these two statements is very different, right? So you might say that to sort of get ahead of ourselves in the course, you might say that not paying your rent is a sufficient reason to believe that you're a bad roommate. Like that's all you really need to, if you're just not paying rent, that's enough to believe this conclusion. Whereas not cleaning your dishes, it's probably not enough. No, I hope that's not enough. Many people commit this sin, but maybe you're a good person all around and you pay your rent and you're nice and you do the laundry or something. So Cleaning your dishes is not a sufficient reason, right? It's not enough all on its own, but it still stands in this inferential relation where if this is true, it makes it more likely to believe, should make you more likely to believe this conclusion. Just not, it's not as strong a relation as you haven't paid your rent for kind of social contextual reasons, right? So the kind of society we live in makes not paying your rent a much more serious matter than not cleaning your dishes. You can imagine a society where that wasn't true, but in our context, yeah, there's a much stronger relation between one of these than the other, but they're both independent reasons because the inferential relation of one doesn't depend on the truth or falsity of the other. Yeah, question?
Is it possible for two premises to independently support a conclusion, but together the premises will negate the conclusion?
Oh, interesting. So is it possible for them to independently support, but when combined, negate the conclusion? I can't imagine a situation like that. I'd be curious. Yeah.
I mean, I haven't really thought about that long, but there's some kind of confounding nature that hasn't been represented.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, something that like might confound, like you know, like something that exists, but and it's influencing both of those independent statements, but you're just not aware of it.
Yeah, I don't. Okay, so there could be something. Yeah, there could be one premise that supports both of those premises, but I don't think that would negate the relationship between these premises and the conclusion, right?
Never mind, I got one.
You got one. All right.
Yeah, it's just, I have a brown chocolate. Implies that I have chocolate.
Yep.
I have black chocolate because I have chocolate.
Yep.
Together, I'm saying the conclusion is I have one chocolate, right? Let's say the conclusion is I have one chocolate, but both of them together can't be
Right.
because you're saying
Right. So they cannot be mutually true. Okay. Yeah, that would be a case. Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Yeah. Good. So it could be possible that the truth of one, but you would never offer an argument of that structure, would you? Like if your argument is such that the premises can't all be, it's not even conceivable that the premises are all true, then you have an even better reason than the logical relationship to say the argument is faulty. It's that the premises are just contradictory with each other. So, okay. So there's that. Now let's do another example. So the cat is sick. One example or one reason to believe that would be that she hasn't eaten her food. Another would be that she won't play with her toys. Either one of those symptoms is evidence of sickness, right? So the fact that she's not eating her food is independently a good reason to believe that the cat is sick, or at least is a reason. And similarly, that she won't play with her toys is also independently a reason to believe. Combined, they are probably a stronger reason. So having both of these premises together gives you a better reason to believe that the cat is sick. So it's not that independent reasons, it just is irrelevant whether the other one is true. Right? So this is a better, if you only had one of these premises, it wouldn't be as good of an argument. However, that's not what makes them independent. Right? What makes them independent is that the inferential relation of this does not depend on the truth of that. Right? Okay. So this might be clearer once we get to the contrast of dependent reasons. But yeah, it's a question.
How about if we change the she hasn't eaten her food to like she's been unusually tired?
How about that?
Sorry?
What happens then?
So would it be reasonable to say that they're not necessarily independent? Because if she's unusually tired, it's very likely that she won't want to play with her toys.
I would not say that those become dependent reasons because being tired is independently of not playing with her toys a reason to believe she's sick, and not playing with her toys is independently of being tired a reason to believe that she's sick. Right? So neither of those require the truth of the other to be evidence for the conclusion. Yeah? But again, they're combined, they make better evidence, like having two true premises that both lead to the conclusion makes a better argument than having just one. And it could be that evidence for one of them is also evidence for the other. So like if I've watched the cat just sort of lay in her box all day, then I have evidence for both of these premises, right? It's the same, you can have one premise be support for both of these.
Okay, so there could be an arrow actually pointing to actually not playing with the toys because that actually is a reason to believe not only the cat might be sick, but she won't want to play with the toys if she's unusually tired.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So Okay. Right. So this will, if this is still unclear, it'll probably become more clear when we talk about the dependent reasons relation, where again, the premises are dependent, and we recommend you do it in the textbook. They talk about V diagrams and T diagrams. So you can see the T here, of course. You draw a line under both, and the arrow comes from the line essentially, as opposed to the V, or it could be a W if there's a bunch of premises. So this is a V diagram, right? This is a T diagram. The reasons for this conclusion depend. A logical relation between these two premises and their conclusion is dependent. That neither one is evidence for the conclusion unless they are both true. So let's look at an example. Yeah. Of course, this famous syllogism that I've been banging on about since the first class. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Right? So these are dependent because so just that all men are mortal does not by itself entail that Socrates is mortal. Right? Similarly, that Socrates is a man does not, unless you also know the fact that all men are mortal, entail that Socrates is mortal. Right? It's only when you combine the two that they have this logical relationship with the conclusion. It's certainly only when you combine them that it has this incredibly tight deductive relationship, where if you believe these top two things, then you are rationally obliged to believe the bottom thing, right? So, right? Yeah, question.
So is it only with dependent reasons that the premises would entail the conclusion?
No, so it's not only when they're dependent reasons that they entail the conclusion. You can have independent reasons that entail the conclusion as well, like in a strong sense. I think you're asking like entail in the like strong logical sense. Yeah. So no, I think you can have independent reasons that are strong logical reasons for a conclusion. Like, for example, when you have two different proofs for a mathematical theorem, like either one of the proofs is fully deductively sufficient to believe the theorem, but they present independent reasons. So. Good. Okay. More examples. So, those who hesitate are lost. You hesitated, therefore you are lost. Right? So, just the fact that you hesitated does not by itself entail that you are lost. And just the fact that those who hesitate are lost does not entail that you are lost. It is only when both of those things are true that they have this logical relationship with the conclusion. Yeah? Okay, so that is the independent and dependent reasons, and we'll go through this at least one more way in order to make it as crystal clear as possible. So the technique, and this is a technique that I picked up from a really great critical reasoning teacher called Donna Warren, is the puzzle piece technique. I'm sorry this did not come across on the slides because of the way it came translated, but on the white background slides. But you should think of dependent reasons as being like puzzle pieces that fit together, right? So there should be some similarity between the two sentences. So those who hesitate are lost. You hesitated, therefore you are lost. Where the middle part of the puzzle piece disappears, right? So there's two parts, and when you put them together, the middle bit disappears. Right? And in this case, so those who hesitate are lost, and that's the same as you hesitated. So hesitation is the common part. Hesitation disappears, drops out, and all you're left with is you are lost. Yeah? Okay? So it's the puzzle piece method. We'll do a bunch of examples, and this should become a fairly reliable method for you. So if you can fit the two premises together in this puzzle piece relation where there's some overlap, and then the overlap disappears in the conclusion, then you have dependent relations. Yeah? And if you don't, if there's not that overlap that disappears, that falls out, then you have independent reasons. Yeah.
There's always something in common between two, like you said, for dependent.
That's right. That's right. There's always a common element You may sometimes have to rephrase slightly to get the element to be common. So unfortunately, in natural language, we're rarely as considerate as we are in logic classes where everything is nicely phrased in common language, but you should be able to see where the commonality is at least if you rephrase slightly. And the examples I'll give you should be phrased in such a way that it's just obvious. Yeah, question?
Something I noticed is like whenever we're doing this, there is this kind of notion that we're making like some kind of valid inference here. Like all the examples have at least been reasonably valid.
Yes, I tried to choose valid inferences, yes.
But if you're symbolizing someone else's argument, what's stopping them from just saying something very weird but still forcing like let's say you're talking to like a politician or something and they're just like full of they're just saying things after things to support their some conclusion.
Right.
You don't really have that analogy you said about like if you leave one false and if the other one's enough to tell the conclusion, that's how you know they're independent or not. Like how do you deal with the context where they might not have that same like notion of like soundness that we're developing? Because all our examples are like sound arguments as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, so the point is that you be able to identify sound arguments, and if somebody presents something that sounds or looks like a sound argument but isn't, then you'll be able to say, aha, that wasn't a sound argument.
So you just don't represent it then, if it's not a sound argument?
Well, you do, I mean, of course you do try to represent it, right? So you do try to take, so if, we'll take a bunch of examples from like politicians as well, and the kind of, messy spin that people put on language and try to make something that's not really an argument sound like an argument. The point of learning these skills is to be able to tell the difference. So if you try to represent it in an argument diagram, the point of that is really just to be able to see if there is a problem somewhere in the flow of things. Right? Right, so you apply this argument diagramming technique, and it really breaks the argument into parts, and you can ask yourself for every part, okay, does this follow? Does that follow? Does this make sense? Does that make sense? And the point is to sort of see through the blather and fluff of language and get to the heart of how arguments are structured, and then you can tell whether it's a good argument or not. That's the great hope and promise of this class. Like, that's what we're trying to accomplish here, so that you can see the structure of an argument behind the words that are presented. And right now, all of the arguments that I'm presenting to you are sort of designed to have their structure just on their face, like it's super obvious what the structure is, or I'm trying to make it as clear as possible. And then as we go through the course, particularly in the second half, we'll start learning techniques for, like, for example, all of the arguments that I've given you so far have had just premises. Like everything has been a premise. Every sentence should have been somehow a premise, or else it's not an argument. Whereas it's certainly not true that everything that people say in an actual argument is a premise. Like they repeat things, or they use rhetorical flourishes, like they say stuff that's irrelevant, like, hey, you're a jerk, that's not a premise, that's just something they say. So one of the things that we're gonna learn how to do is to sort of sift through and find just the premises. And then once you've found just the premises, you can ask, okay, do these premises stand in a proper logical relationship to their conclusion? And furthermore, are they true? So that's the goal. Yeah, people will not present arguments to you. Sadly, people will not present arguments to you in nice, clear form. It's up to you to be able to sort of see how they're structured, how the argument is at least supposed to be structured. Okay, so back to the puzzle piece technique. Here's another one. So Gonzo is a dog, all dogs are friendly, therefore Gonzo is friendly. It's a really crisp example of this. So Gonzo is a dog, all dogs are friendly. So what is the common part of that drops out? Is a dog. Yeah, like the idea of being a dog. And all dogs is not the same as is a dog, but the dogginess is what's shared between the two premises, and that's the bit that falls out of the conclusion, right? So you have this rule about all dogs, you have Gonzo as a dog, and then you can apply the rule to Gonzo because of that shared thing and derive the conclusion that Gonzo's friendly. Yeah, question?
So then is it the subject that you draw?
Is it the subject or predicate that you drop? So is a dog, so in the first one, Gonzo is a dog, Gonzo is the subject, and is a dog is the predicate. In the second one, all dogs are friendly, dogs are the subject, and friendly is the predicate. So yeah, it looks like in this one, wait, no, it's different. Yeah, so in one is the subject and in the other. So in the first one, Gonzo is the subject and Gonzo is not dropped out. In the second one, all dogs are the subject and all dogs are dropped out. So you can't just say it's just always the subject or predicate that falls out. Yeah, question?
I think at least in this structure, the way the syllogism works, the first premise, the subject takes on the predicate of the second.
Good.
Yeah.
Good, yeah, so.
It's basically saying A is B and B is C, so A becomes C.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in this case, yeah, the subject of the first one takes on the predicate of the second. Again, unfortunately, people are rarely so nice as to order them properly, so you can't sort of say which is the first and which is the second. They'll very often offer them in different orders. So yeah. But that's good. That's a good sort of analysis of what's up here. Right. So that's the puzzle piece method of determining whether predicates are dependent or independent reasons for their conclusion. Thanks, Donna Warren. She's a really great critical reasoning teacher in the States. All right. Right. So one of the exercises we're going to have you do at the end of this, after I'm done my talky bit, is to have you determine, so first, find the premises and the conclusions of a short argument. Before there was typically just one premise. Now we'll have two premises and a conclusion. So you'll identify the premises, identify the conclusion, and then tell me whether they are dependent or independent reasons for believing the conclusion. Right? And that's sort of like argument mapping step 2. Once you get this, you'll be ready for complex argument diagrams. Once you have complex argument diagrams, you'll be ready to start doing things like sifting out which parts are premises and which aren't. You'll be ready for doing things like finding missing premises. You'll be ready for doing things like finding missing conclusions or determining the conclusion when it's ambiguous. Like right now, hopefully it's fairly clear what the conclusion always is, but you'll find that in real-time arguments or real-time debates, very often the conclusion is ambiguous. Very often you think the conclusion is one thing and the other person thinks the conclusion is another, and you'll yell at each other for hours, not realizing that you might even agree if you just knew what the other person was trying to establish. So in actual argumentative contexts, discovering the conclusion is actually a feat of inference. Like it's an inferential feat of magic to like properly identify what the actual conclusion is. We'll work up to that. But so that's the plan. Right, so do some examples all together. So are these dependent or independent premises for the conclusion we are not going to hunt rhinos? You can just yell it out. What do you think? Independent. Independent. Because?
Both are good reasons to not hunt rhinos.
Good, exactly. So if you didn't know that P2 was true, P1 would still be a good reason for C. And if you didn't know that P2 was true, did I just say P? Anyway, so both are good reasons. Also, if you apply the puzzle piece test, does this pass the puzzle piece test? Or I don't know if pass or fail is the right word, but like, given that there doesn't seem to be any clear linguistic overlap in the premises, right? The puzzle piece test seems to suggest that these are independent reasons for the conclusion. So you can kind of see it from the mechanical puzzle piece test, and you can kind of see it just by thinking about these premises, thinking about what would be the case if one was false and the other was true. I mean, they would still be reasons for the conclusion. Good. Dependent or independent reasons for believing the conclusion. A poor diet can lead to stomach trouble. You have a poor diet, therefore you're at risk for stomach trouble. Dependent reasons. Right? Just thinking that you have a poor diet is not necessarily a reason for believing C unless you also believe P1. Like it's the fact that you can infer C from P2 shows that at least implicitly you have P1 in the back of your mind. right? You have some rule of inference that says this is caused by that. This is related to that causally, right? And, of course, we apply the puzzle piece test. We have this common thing, a poor diet, a poor diet. So you have a risk of stomach trouble. The thing that you're at risk of stomach trouble comes out of like chopping out the poor diet part of that. Yeah? Good. Dependent or independent? I see a light on in the window next door. I can hear music coming through the wall. Therefore, my neighbors are at home. Independent. Independent. So these are two different types of evidence for the conclusion, right? You've got visual evidence, you've got auditory evidence, and either one of them would be at least some evidence for believing the conclusion. Neither one of them is conclusive evidence, and in fact, even together, they're not conclusive evidence, right? They could have just left the lights on and their music playing. However, they're both reasons to believe, at least to raise your belief level, raise your confidence level that your neighbors are home. Furthermore, the puzzle piece test shows there's no overlap here, right? These are just separate phrases, separate ideas that don't combine additively, like they don't have the overlap that then drops out, giving you the conclusion. Yeah? Good. Okay, so that was it for dependent and independent reasons. I don't want to push too hard on that. We'll do lots more complexity and argument mapping later, but keep that in mind. We'll do some exercises when we're done. Unless there's any further questions about that, just quickly before we move on. Okay, there will be lots of time to have fun with dependent and independent reasons, and this is one of those things that if I'm doing my job properly, you'll be super duper sick of this by the end of the semester. So. But that was really like, this is one of the most basic and crucial elements of argument diagramming, which is one of the most crucial and basic parts of this course. So really want you to get this really well. And we'll do it again and again and just like in slightly more complex ways as we go along. All right, so let's move on to meaning and definitions. This is gonna be fun. This is philosopher stuff, proper philosopher stuff. So. Basically, according to the textbook, and I think it's a fairly reasonable way of breaking things up, there are essentially three types of definition: reportive definition, stipulative definition, and essentialist definition. So let's get into them. So a reportive definition, this is the main common way of defining things. So a definition which simply reports how people use a word or phrase. This is the kind of definition that you find in dictionaries. So the job of dictionary makers is to give reportive definitions, to capture the way that words are typically used. And just as an aside, because I find this super duper annoying when people do this in argument, dictionary makers do not have a magical word elf that tells them what words really mean. Okay, so citing the dictionary in an argument is not that great of a way of proving what that word really means, right? They do their best. They give their best account of how words are typically used, but citing the dictionary is usually a bad strategy for when the meaning of a word is under dispute. You say, well, that's not how everybody uses it. That's not always how it's used, or we should be using it in a different way. Citing the dictionary to contradict that kind of claim is not a good argumentative strategy, because they're just nerds like you and me, right? They're just people who are trying to capture how they think words are being used. Right. So, sorry, pet peeve. Right, so a reportive definition. And notice the problem with a reportive definition, the essential problem with a reportive definition is that it relies on people to act consistently and to use words consistently, right? And they don't. We don't. We use words all kinds of different ways. We use words variously, different people, different groups use words differently. There's absolutely no guarantee that people will use words in a consistent way. So when you give a reportive definition, you're trying to give a definition that, gets most of how people use a word, but the chances that you're going to capture all of the uses and only the uses is very low. Language is just way too messy most of the time. But it's important for linguistic clarity. Like this kind of definition is probably the most common type of definition that you'll be familiar with. So reportive definitions. And then we have stipulative definitions. We're doing a lot of that in this class. So you can define a word stipulatively when you stipulate what you mean by it. You say, in this context, by this word, I will mean. So it's very common in legal contexts where all that stuff about, I just said about reportive definitions, where it's like it's fuzzy, people use the word differently. That's no good when people's life and livelihoods are on the line. So what lawyers do is say, by house, I mean exactly and only this. Right? Similarly, in this class, I said, by argument, I mean exactly and only premises which are supposed to make you believe a conclusion. Right? So I cut off most of the ways that word is used and say, we're only talking about this. So if I say, and we also see it in other technical contexts. We do this in philosophy all the time. So we say, by cause, I mean exactly and only this. And what you're doing there is asking somebody to forget what they know about how words are commonly used and accept a definition that you're presenting for the sake of that conversation. Or for the sake of being a lawyer, for example. Like the law does this in a much broader way and says, look, in legal context, by this word, we mean this. Right? And that's different than the stipulative definition. When you're reportive definition, you're not just reporting on how people typically use the word. You're saying, I'm using this word this way. And you kind of can't be wrong about giving a stipulative definition. And if you say, by this, I mean that, you're not supposed to be held to the standard of like, does people normally use the word that way? You're just setting it up. So, for example, if I say, in this discussion by eggplants, I mean what people usually mean by bananas, then eggplants peeled and eaten raw are tasty is true. Right? Flies completely in the face of how you usually use the word eggplant. But if you're saying, here's a stipulative definition of eggplant, it's this yellow thing that peels and tastes good, and you can chop it over your cereal. Right? A stipulative definition can take a word that usually means one thing and make it mean another thing for the purposes of a conversation. People don't do this. I mean, don't do this, of course. Don't just sort of make words mean weird random things. But that's what a stipulative definition is when you say, forget everything you know about this word. Here's what it means for today or for right now. Yeah? Okay. And essentialist definitions. So in reportive definitions, the meaning of a word is determined by how people commonly use it. Stipulative definitions, meaning is determined by somebody laying down a specific meaning. In essentialist definitions, the meaning of the word is set by nature in some sense. It's set objectively. Right? So when you discover what a word that you thought meant one thing means another. So people use the word water for a really, really long time, or its cognates in other languages, of course. We referred to water successfully for probably as long as we've been using language. And then we discovered that water really means two hydrogens and an oxygen bonded together. That was a discovery about the meaning of the term. And so that's an essentialist definition. You primarily only find essentialist definitions, I think, in science, where there are natural kinds. So like we discovered what gold really is. It's an element. It's got this many protons, this many neutrons, typically has this many electrons, right? That's where you take a term, and it's not the fact that it wasn't that people typically used water to mean two hydrogens and an oxygen bonded together. And it's not that somebody stipulated that exactly. It's more like we discovered that that was a better way of speaking. Right? Yeah, question?
This seems to conflict with how the text describes it.
Oh yeah?
It uses an example of justice.
Justice, yes.
And an essentialist definition deals with the essence. So.
Yes, so, right, so the textbook talks about things with essences.
Yeah.
And that's controversial to think that anything has an essence. So for example, I don't think justice has an essence.
Well, necessarily
Yeah, Platonists think that things like justice and knowledge and goodness have essences. Then what the job of a philosopher is to discover what is justice really. I think you can discover what is gold really, that scientists did that, but probably not justice. That's my personal philosophical bent, so I don't expect you to all believe that just because I said it, but my tendency is to think that there's not really an essential nature of justice. There's a way that people use that word, and there are ways that you can use. They certainly have a stipulative definition of justice in law, but probably there's not an essence of justice as far as I'm concerned. Yeah.
Isn't this just trying to say that you define the word in terms of its essence? So like the essence of water as we know it is H2O, so
Yeah,
you
good.
define it in terms of that.
Good. Yeah. So something like water maybe it does have an essence. So and this is just saying like yeah, there's an essence of water, and this essentialist definition just sort of tries to track that. So for things like natural kinds, like the essence of gold, the essence of water, the essence of things like fundamental particles probably have a really nice essence. Like a proton has a really nice, reliable set of properties, and we can discover those properties. And you can be wrong about it. Like they've been trying to measure the exact weight of the electron for decades and decades. And it's not just that we stipulate the electron is a particle with this weight. We try to figure out what the proper way of using that term is. Philosophers have been trying to find out the essence of justice for a couple of millennia with mixed success. Let's generously say mixed success on that project. And somebody like Ludwig Wittgenstein in his later work argues that that was just kind of a mistake, and that a lot of philosophy was basically a waste of time chasing after essences for things that don't really have essences, and that the meaning of almost all words can be better treated in terms of reportive definitions than essentialist definitions. So if you believe that everything has essences, then you should spend all your time trying to like drill down into the core of concepts and like understand what they really mean. What is the nature of explanation really, or what is the nature of arguments really? I don't know how much use that is. If there's somebody behind you who's going to ask a question.
So,
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. No, that's you. Yeah.
so when someone uses like a short form of,
Yeah.
of a word,
Yeah.
is that a reportive definition?
A short form of a word. I don't think if you're using a short form, can you give me an example? Because I don't think you're defining
I don't know, like GDP or something.
GDP. So yeah, I don't think you're defining, so gross domestic product, you can define gross domestic product in various ways, but giving a short form, like an acronym or a synonym, you're not really defining the word. So you're not trying to communicate what the word really means. Yeah, okay, now you.
Okay, so for the essentialist definition, is it safe to say that it's an attempt to describe an object, I guess, at a foundational level, or like?
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
More like concrete words then? Is that it? Whereas like abstract words like freedom and like love, not really.
Yeah, yeah, that might be one way of going about sorting out what does and doesn't have, so the concrete versus abstract. I don't know, like, so I also think that triangle probably has a good essence. Like, triangle is a fairly, in some sense, an abstract term. It's like an abstract mathematical structure. But on the other hand, it looks like an electron in the sense that you can come up with like really good definitions of what a triangle really is. I don't know. We're getting into the deep waters of philosophy here. Like, what has an essence and what doesn't have an essence. I don't know. Let me just lay on the table that I don't have a definitive answer for that question. We're not going to solve that one today, but we can pick away at it. Yeah.
Well, what about like, 'cause when you say H2O, like, I mean, when I just look at it firsthand, like, I kind of like agree that like there's no, like, I would consider that essential definition, but what if that was like an acronym for something? Like, we're kind of back to like stipulative definition in some sense.
Well, it's an acronym for hydrogen times 2 plus oxygen.
No, but what if there's like a company called like H2O or something?
Oh, I see.
I mean,
Right,
like,
right.
it's like, because I know that, I can't think of one right off the top of my head, but I know that there's like some examples where it's like, if it's used in a certain way, like it really means something completely different.
Absolutely.
Even GDP actually, like, yeah, GDP or something, like,
Yeah.
that goes through the acronyms, like, you don't really know.
Sure. So yeah, if there's a company called, undoubtedly there are companies called H2O. It's too catchy of a phrase to not brand. So there's definitely companies called H2O, and they are not, the essence of those companies is not two hydrogens bonded to an oxygen, obviously. So, yeah, so,
So could that be like stipulated definition then? Because it really kind of is based on, like, when we say H2O, we mean this company, not like water.
yeah.
Even though the company might not do something maybe with water, that's kind of maybe the point why they call it that.
So the the stipulative definition is when you say my company is called H2O. That would be a stipulative sort of naming of the company. In some sense, we want to distinguish naming from definition, right? So the referent of a name is just the object in the world that the name refers to. It's not really the same as a definition exactly, because definition also has a sense, right? So all of the water in the world is the reference of the term water, of course. But there's more to the concept than just the reference. There's the sense of it. Like how would you go about finding water is included in the meaning of it.
But
So.
like if H2O actually, like you say that H2O is a company that does so and so, is that essence or is that?
No, I think that's clearly stipulative. That's a naming, not a definition.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Did you?
I think an easier way of thinking about it is essentialist definitions are just stipulative definitions, except the being setting them is nature itself.
Awesome. So yeah, essentialist definitions are just stipulations by nature itself.
So independent of people.
I guess so. Yeah. So these are the definitions that God came up with, or something like that. Yeah.
Can't essentialist definitions change according to new empirical discovery?
Right. So.
So it's not actually nature defining the term, it's those people who see nature that way that define it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So in some sense, the distinctive feature of essentialist definitions is that you can be wrong about them. So we used to, at least the Greek tradition considered water to be one of the four elements and contrasted it with air, earth, and fire. We might want to just say, well, that's what they thought the essence of water was, but they were wrong about that. Now we have a better grip on the essence of water. And maybe in another 2,000 years, we'll have an even better grip on the essence of water, something like that. So in that case, I wouldn't say that the definition has changed. I think we were mistaken about the proper definition.
So it's a contextual, empirical definition.
Our attempts at providing essentialist definitions are contextual, empirical.
Right.
Yeah. It's a good thing to keep in mind because we attempt to provide essentialist definitions, but maybe we don't always succeed. Yeah.
So could you say that the essential definitions are pretty much just common ground for like everyone? In a sense, like if you're saying that water is H2O, you
Yeah.
would go to any other place in the world. You could say, "Can I have some H2O?" and it would imply that you mean water.
You might hope so, but you can't rely on people like that because not everybody knows that. Like, if you say water is H2O, a goodly percentage of the population will look at you cross-eyed and just say, "I don't know what that means." They just don't know this. Like, you all are actually exceptionally educated in the history of humanity. Like, compared to practically every human that has ever been, you guys are all like wildly educated, crazy amounts of education. So saying like it's something that all people share is too generous to people, I would say. Certainly not everybody knows that like gold is defined as one of the elements on the periodic table. Like you might not get, if you ask people like what's the definition of the top quark, even fewer people will have an answer for you. So it's something that is still an essentialist definition, but there's no guarantee that everybody agrees or that everybody knows. And oftentimes we have debates about what the proper essential definition of a thing is. Yeah.
If you talk about like just let's say recipe of food, right? A certain dish. Now the same recipe will vary from state to state, right? But the general concept will be the same, right?
Yeah.
Now, is that essentialist or is that
Report. So the question is, so take the names of recipes. Is there an essence to the recipe, or is that just a reportive definition? I think this is a really interesting question for modern cuisine because typically people are obsessed with the authenticity of their dishes, right? You want to get pad thai, this real authentic pad thai, and that assumes that there's an essence of pad thai that things are either closer or farther away from. I don't see any really good reason to believe that that's true. I don't believe that there are essences of recipes, unless there's like, there'd have to be some fact of nature about like what the proper pad thai tastes like, or how to make a proper pad thai. That's a fact independently of anybody's beliefs. I don't really see any reason to believe that. Okay, let's move on. The essentialist definition question has clearly gotten us into the deep waters of philosophy. If you'd like to know more, please take a degree in philosophy. We'd love to have you. You can start with Plato. The best place to start here is Plato, because Plato is the guy who introduced this idea that all of the common things that you care about have essences, like justice and knowledge and truth and goodness and beauty. Plato thought all of those things had essential definitions, and if you just bugged people hard enough, you'd find out what they are. They killed him for it, by the way. This is something about the really deep insight into how philosophers act and think, that our hero, our main historical hero, was so annoying that they killed him. And you get the feeling that people don't hold this up as a warning story. So Aristotle also got threatened with death, and he left. He's like, goodbye. I'm going to not die. I'll keep being a philosopher. And people, you can tell that philosophers kind of like, yeah, if he had more cojones, he would have stuck around and got killed. I think that's a terrible lesson to be teaching people. But yeah, so yeah, if you want to know more about essentialist definitions, I recommend you start with all of philosophy, or much of philosophy, up until the 20th century, when we kind of started giving up on this. We started saying, maybe there's not so many essences around as we thought there were. Some people think there are none. Some people think that there are no essential definitions. There are only good reportive and stipulative definitions that are handy. Some people think there are some, like natural kinds. Probably there's no essential definition of human, right? Probably there's no essence of humanity. If we're an evolved species, that means all of our properties have been slowly changing over time and will probably continue to change over time. So species looked like a really nice case for an essential definition, and biologists have slowly been giving up on that idea. So the essences have been disappearing from the world left and right, and we're left with just our dumb ways of talking. But, oh man, I do go on and on. All right, let's take a break. We've been going for 50 minutes now. Let's take a 5-minute break, and we'll come back and talk more about definitions. Okay. So, before we do this, I want to do an example that is probably too, I hope we don't have an excessive amount of fun with it. Okay, so, I'm serious. So, who can give me a definition of racism? Just any definition that springs to mind. Yes?
Belief that a particular group and or race of people possesses a particular characteristic or set thereof.
Good, so the attribution of attributes to race, to a group or race. That's one definition. Who's got another definition? Yeah?
Maybe thinking that a certain race is like.
So the belief in, I think that's probably, so I think probably it's not racist to just say there are races that have characteristics, but this is definitely racism, where you say one race is better than another. Okay, who can give me another definition of racism? The one that's popular amongst political people. Yeah. Or maybe you have a different one, but yeah.
I don't know if it's popular, but prejudice on the basis of race.
That's a good one as well, prejudice on the basis of race. Who's got another one? Discrimination based on race? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, another one, discrimination based on color of skin. There's another definition that I have in mind here. Yeah. Bigotry in general, it's a little less specific than racism in particular. Okay, so maybe this is less common than I thought it would be. So one of the definitions that people insist on of racism is discrimination based on race along systematic power lines. So it's racism when somebody from a privileged race discriminates against people who have less power, but not racist if somebody with less power discriminates against the group that has power in that society. So are you familiar with this? Okay, good. So that was what I was kind of fishing for. There's definitions of racism that include the power relation, that it's like you have to be racist, you have to be in the group of power in that society. And there's definitions of racism that are just like the ones that we were talking about, where it's just any discrimination whatsoever. Yeah? Okay, so I would like to propose that these two definitions are different types of definitions. Okay, so the one that most of you produced when asked, like, what's the definition of racism, was the reportive definition. Like, this is how people typically use the word racism, is just discrimination based on race, right? Now, there's kind of political reasons or moral reasons why you might want this other definition that says you really should only call it racism in cases where you're discriminating against people that don't have as much power in that society, right? Because racism is a powerful word. I don't want to be a racist. Most people don't want to be called racists. So it has this power that you kind of want to be deployed for people who need it, rather than for people who just like don't like people being mean to them, right? So there's a moral reason to stipulate that the definition should be one that includes the power dynamics, not just the fact of which broad racial categories you fall under. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So if the power dynamic is not present, can it still be considered racism, or is it
On which definition? So it depends on which definition you're using. In the kind of stipulative definition that's popular, at least on my social media, where they say the power dynamic is the essential part of racism, then they would say, no, if somebody makes fun of me for being a white guy in North America in the 21st century, that's not racism because I'm part of the group that's having a pretty good time right now. Whereas if somebody discriminates against, well, practically any other racial group, frankly, but that shouldn't be called racism. You could call it discrimination, or you could call it bias, or you could call it just being mean or something like that. But they think that we should stipulate that the definition ought to be one that includes power dynamics for these moral reasons, because you want to help people that need help, not people that already are doing just fine, thank you very much. Yeah? Okay, so this is a case where, and I think a huge amount of really confused, because people will give you the stipulative definition, like, look, don't call it racism unless it's against people that are being discriminated against systematically. And people go, well, but that's not what the dictionary says. Right? That's not how people usually talk. What are you talking about? And what they're doing is shifting to the reportive criteria for definitions when this is being offered as a stipulative definition. Right? They're saying, look, there's a good reason to use this word in a specific way regardless of how other people use it. And people who push back against this are typically saying, well, but that's not a good reportive definition because that's not what it says in the dictionary, and that's not how people use it on a typical basis. Yeah? So I would suggest to you that if you find yourself embroiled in this debate, this sort of distinction between reportive and stipulative definitions would be helpful. Right? So there's a good moral argument for the stipulative definition, but the reportive definition is by far the more common one. Right? It's the one that if you just ask a random person what's the definition, they'll probably give you the standard reportive definition. Okay, good. We didn't have too much fun with that. I'm relieved. The question for me in this course is like, how hot an issue do we want to take as examples? I don't want it to be totally boring, but I also don't want this room to explode into like excessively heated debate. If I can make a confession, I am a recovering argument jerk. I'm sure you've met an argument jerk. This person, like Socrates, they killed him for being so annoying. An argument jerk is somebody who doesn't know when it's a good time and when it's a bad time to present an argument. They can't read the room and tell like, okay, this is no longer fun for everybody else. Now you're just trying to make yourself feel good and feel smart, or you're trying to demean somebody and belittle them. Like the goal is not to come to mutual understanding, it's just to make the other person feel bad. So you're using your words as a kind of club to bully people. So the nightmare scenario, as a recovering argument jerk, I work really hard not to be like this anymore and to be like this as little as I possibly can. The nightmare scenario for me is that I use this platform, this class as a platform to train up a bunch of fresh argument jerks. That would be the worst case scenario for me here. What I would love is to get you to the point where you can debate respectfully, where you can debate constructively, where you're not treating your interlocutors as people to be beaten down, but as resources to kind of come to common mutual understanding with. So I'm really trying to find the please help me find the nice middle ground where we're engaged in interesting and important debates, but we're not being argument jerks. So just thought I'd throw that out there for future consideration. If you see me doing this, please remind me. Hey, Corey, you being a jerk? All right. Okay, good. So there's that. All right, so the ones that we can really assess, the type of definitions that we can really assess are reportive definitions. It's hard to assess essentialist definitions if you're not a scientist, as far as I'm concerned, or Socrates. Let's not be Socrates, so, and we're not doing science, so let's just talk about evaluating reportive definitions. So when is a definition, there's at least 3 ways that a reportive definition can go wrong. It can be too narrow, too broad, or both too broad and too narrow. So my handy dandy diagram. A definition is too broad if it includes things that do not match the accepted meaning of the term. So a chair is a piece of furniture meant for sitting on is a too broad definition. Why is that? Yeah. You could sit on a lot of things. You could totally sit on a couch, which is not a chair. You can sit on a bed, which is not a chair. So a piece of furniture meant for sitting on, it captures all the chairs, right? But it captures a bunch of other things as well. So it's too broad of a definition. So here's what happens if you have too broad of a definition in your argument. P1, a typewriter is a means of writing. It's a good, too broad definition. Now, since you all have implements of writing, I can infer that you all have typewriters. It's very quiet for a room full of people with typewriters, so I think there's something wrong with that argument, right? So the problem was that the definition given in P1 of typewriter was too broad. So if you have too broad definitions, your arguments will go wrong. Good. Similarly, a reportive definition, and keep in mind, these are all just the conditions for reportive definitions. Maybe you could do this for essentialist definitions as well, but not stipulative definitions. Stipulative definitions are exactly as broad and narrow as whatever you said they are. That's the end of the story. There's no like further evaluation. It's only if you're doing a reportive definition. So a reportive definition is too narrow if it fails to include some of the ways that the word is actually used. So a school is an institution that aims at teaching children how to read and write. This leaves out, of course, music school, ballet school. It leaves out universities where we're not teaching you how to read and write exactly. We're teaching you lots of other stuff as well, of course. A school of fish, yes, yes. We should distinguish, and this goes also to the company branded H2O. We should distinguish. They're not synonyms. Are they synonyms or homonyms? What's the word for 2 words that look the same but are different? Homonyms. Thank you. Thank you. I did very badly in English. I'm sorry. So homonyms. So school of fish and school in this case I would propose homonyms. They're different words that just happen to use the same letters and sounds. And similarly, H2O, the brand for whatever that is, probably a spa or something. That's a homonym for water, but it's not the same word. We should distinguish these as different words. All right. Okay. And again, your arguments will go wrong. If your definitions are too narrow, your arguments will go wrong. A farm is a place where vegetables are grown. This farm only raises chickens. Therefore, chickens are a kind of vegetable. Incorrect, because the definition was too narrow. There are uses of the word that are not captured by the scope of the definition. This shouldn't be too hectic. Right, so, but they can also be too broad and too narrow. So there can be things that are not captured. The scope of the definition can fail to capture some of the uses of the word, and can apply to things that are not falling under the uses of the word. So for example, hockey is a game played on ice in Canada. Right? It's too narrow because, of course, they play hockey in other countries. It's also too broad. Why did I think this was too broad? Can you tell me why this is too broad?
Could it be because there are other games that you can play on ice?
Good. So if there are other games played on ice in Canada that aren't hockey, that would make it too broad. Thank you. I legitimately could not remember why I thought that was too broad. Yeah.
Are there though?
Are there? Are there? Isn't shinny a game? Curling, of course, curling. Thank you. Yes, you're kicked out of the country. Yeah.
You can play in other countries.
What's that?
You can play in other countries.
You could play in under, so that's why it's too narrow. Yeah. Yeah. And there's another comment behind you. Yeah.
If there are other games that play on ice, and does that mean it's too narrow? Then it's only.
Yeah, no, I think it may, if there are other games played on ice, I think that's something that falls under the scope of the definition, but not the use of the word hockey. Yeah? So something's too narrow if the scope of the definition is doesn't cover all the cases in the use, and too broad if it covers things that are not falling under the use. So hockey is a game played on ice in Canada is too broad to the extent that there are other games that are played on ice in Canada that are not hockey, and too narrow to the extent that it doesn't capture all of the instances of hockey that you would want to fall under your definition. Yeah? Yeah.
No, I kind of agree with her. That is an example of narrowness.
Is it?
Yeah, because the set isn't referring to more than it should.
Okay, so so the definition of hockey given here is too narrow because it does not include. So.
Wait, yeah. So then where is it broad, right? Where is it referring to something that it shouldn't refer to?
So it's referring to curling. Curling is one of the examples where this definition refers to curling, but that shouldn't fall under the definition. So it's too broad in that sense, but it's too narrow because there are examples of hockey in other countries, and that should cover those. Yeah? Okay. Now, if you're feeling confused and upset, that's probably good. Add on to that the fact that words only have really fuzzy definitions, really, in the reportive sense. People use all kinds of words, all kinds of ways, and there's probably not going to be a sort of a core essence of the word. So this should be a troubling prospect for you, like that the words that you're using really have unclear boundaries, should at least slightly disquiet you. All right. Okay, so let's try these. Are these too broad, too narrow, or both? A Supreme Court is the highest court in Canada. Yeah. Too narrow. Why is that?
Well, it says a Supreme Court, and I'm assuming, well, I can say that other countries have Supreme Courts as well.
Exactly. So it's too narrow because this definition restricts the scope to not include things that should be included. So if you want a definition of a Supreme Court, you should say something like what? Like, yeah.
The Supreme Court of Canada is court that way you at least have the definition restricted that.
Good. So you see, if we say the Supreme Court of Canada is the highest court in Canada, that seems like an all right definition, right? Sort of fixed it. It's not too narrow now, at least. Or you could say, if you wanted to keep the Supreme Court clause, you could say a Supreme Court is the highest court in a country. That would likewise say, I think that would fairly reasonably, unless, they probably call it something else in other countries, though. Okay, yeah.
But is there an element to that definition where it's kind of circular? Because when you try to find Supreme Court, you're using the word court to describe Supreme Court.
Okay.
Because I could kind of guess what Supreme Court is based on like those guidelines. Like supreme means the biggest,
Well,
the highest and the hierarchy.
But
Yep.
in order for it to be circular, you would have to assume that the word court wasn't defined.
Right, so we're not trying to define, oh, that's a good point. So we're not trying to define court in this, we're trying to define Supreme Court. And people are funny with words, so just because it's called the Supreme Court doesn't automatically make it the highest court. There could be like the Ultra Supreme Court. People do stuff like that all the time. Where the literal, what you would think is the literal content of the phrase doesn't actually translate into the meaning of the word. This is, George Carlin is the master of pulling this out, where it's like, it should be the highest court. It's called the Supreme Court, but maybe it's not. Yeah. Okay. Reasonably satisfied with that one? Okay, let's move on. So poetry is an art form that uses words to convey images and ideas. Yeah.
It's too broad
Excellent. Why is that?
because stories convey images and ideas.
Right. So stories are an art form that convey images and ideas, but they're not poetry necessarily. You have prose stories. Very good. Is this also, so this is, what was that, too broad or too narrow? It's too broad. Is it also too narrow in some way? Yeah?
I guess poetry can convey a story.
Yeah, right. So maybe it's not the point of a poem to convey an image or an idea. Yeah. Good. I mean, there's weird concrete poetry that's just like a letter in this corner of the page and like a word down here or something like that. And it's very hard to see that it's, the point of concrete poetry, I take it, is just to be words on a page that evoke some emotional response, but not necessarily a specific idea or image. So this is both, if that's right, if we include concrete poetry, this weird sort of like when back in typewriter days, they just like type a couple of letters here and there. If that's a kind of poem, then this is too broad and too narrow. I think if you get real super nitpicky, you can probably find ways in which to make any definition too broad or too narrow. I won't do this to you, but my mother constantly recounts her first year of university where they spent a days and days trying to define a chair. And if you get nitpicky enough, it becomes almost impossible to come up with a definition of chair that is neither too broad nor too narrow. Like a thing for sitting on, well, that's lots of things. A four-legged thing for sitting on, well, you could have a four-legged stool. A thing with a back for sitting on, well, you can have a love seat, and so on and so forth. You can go on and on. I won't torment you with that, but you get the idea that typically, if you were to get real nitpicky, even with dictionary definitions, they'll turn out to be slightly too broad or slightly too narrow, typically. All right, a bungalow is a one-story building. Too broad, too narrow, or both? Too broad. So what's a one-story building that's not a bungalow? Yeah. Like a garage or anything. Yeah. A which? A rancher. I don't know what a rancher is. Yeah, like a one-story convenience store. It's not a bungalow. A bungalow is supposed to be a home or a house or something like that. So that's too broad. Is it too narrow in some way? Could be. Yeah.
A bungalow can also have like a basement. That would make it.
Can it?
Wouldn't it just like not be one story then?
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So can
Or,
I?
like, you would, like, have an attic.
Yeah. How do we count stories? Yeah. Okay. Since nothing real deep seems to hang on the definition of bungalow, I propose to just leave it ambiguous and move on. But again, I hope you're getting from this exercise that these definitions are hard and often ambiguous. Yeah.
What's a bungalow? No, I know it refers to someone where you stay, but like, how do you strictly define a bungalow where you can't be confused?
So my best shot would be like a one-story home. But then what counts as a story? Yeah. Good. I'm glad to see that you're frustrated and upset about this, because you should be. You should be frustrated and upset by how vague our language is. It can seem like there should be crisp definitions for everything until you begin to pick away at them, and then you find that all of these words that seem so amazingly transparent are actually very hard to define, are very hard to give crisp definitions for. This was one of the great insights of 20th century philosophy, actually. So again, the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein started off his life thinking that all words should have crisp definitions, and actually thought that the language should be reformed to make them crisper. But then ended his career saying things like, words don't have prototypical definitions, they don't have essentialist definitions, what they have are family resemblances. So the metaphor is, my family has a kind of resemblance to each other. I have a brother and a sister and a mother and a father, and we have I have the similar nose as my brother, I might have similar eyes as my sister, I've got the chin of my mother, I've got the ears of my father. There's no member of the family that shares all of those characteristics though, right? So there's not one essential like Lewis family look. However, there are a bunch of shared characteristics between us that tie us together in what's called a family resemblance. And his best example of this was games. So like, what's a game? What's a thing that all games have in common? Yeah, they are played. What about the game of life, which is a cellular automata? It's a zero-player game. There are such things as zero-player games in game theory. Right, yeah. Okay, competition. So what about games like the game of solitaire?
Self-competition.
Maybe, yeah.
You have to be nitpicky, but game of life is not a game.
Well, they call it, it's right in the name. Of course it's a game.
I can give a name. I can.
I know,
call myself an apple. Doesn't make me
I'm just being facetious. I'm just being facetious. Yeah. So, but they do in game theory. They do talk about zero-player games, and is one of the ways. It's certainly one of the ways that people use the word game. Right. So if we're doing a reportive definition, people totally talk about zero-player games where it's just a thing that happens and there's nobody actually playing the game. Okay, so I hand over here. Yeah.
I guess it's something that has like rules or a pattern or a design of some sort.
So is a tree a game? If it's a tree has rules and a pattern and a design.
You could say it has a design.
Yeah, it's got a pattern,
Yeah.
tree-like pattern, branching structure. Yeah. Most games have an objective. So. Sure, sure. I think you could say most games do. If my game of life thing is actually a game, then it doesn't really have an objective. You can play like if you play catch, is that really like an objective? You're just kind of throwing the ball around? That's right, that's true. Yeah. But is that, okay, so that's maybe that might even be, well, again, if zero-player games are games, then there are games without objectives. Yeah.
Yeah, so for that game of like catch, like the objective is to continue that process for as long as possible until you either get bored or don't want to do it. Like that'd be a valid way of saying it.
I guess so. But I think you can't, so that's, even supposing that we accepted objective as a thing that all games have in common, it's not a definition yet because it's way too broad still. Yeah.
How does a game not have any players? Even though there's no objective?
Well, because there's nobody to have an objective. For something to be an objective, there has to be an agent pursuing that objective. So any goal implies an agent that has an interest in pursuing the goal. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Could you give an example of a zero-player game?
The game of life, Conway's Game of Life. I won't explain it, but it's what's called a cellular automata, where there are very simple rules that define in a grid whether they're on or off. I'm sorry, Google it. It's probably too obscure and not related enough to the content of the course to where it's really getting into. But yeah.
So wait, so are you saying, if you look at it from the perspective, maybe if you look at it from the perspective of God, right?
Yep.
He just created the game and then he's not really playing, he's just letting things go.
It's like watching two computers play chess.
Good. Yeah. So chess between two computers would be an example of.
You still have players. Like the computers
Well.
are making moves.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So this is just meant to be an example. This is one that philosophers generally agree upon, that if you keep going and going, you're probably not going to hit a bedrock where you get just one definition of game. Probably there are things that don't, like, there are a bunch of things that fall under the term game, but there's not one essential set of properties that classify that all games have and only games have, is the point. Probably game is more like a family resemblance. Like, I have my mom's chin and my dad's ears. My mom doesn't have my dad's ears, and my dad doesn't have my mom's chin. So there's not one property that we all share. It's just a bunch of sort of loosely related properties that come together under the term game. This is the Wittgenstein's notion of a family resemblance. And if you look at how people use words, we don't really seem to care too much about having essential definitions, like definitions that are both exactly as broad and narrow as they should be. We use words in really loose and informal ways typically. And we don't try to like bring it down to a real crisp definition. The place you'll find real crisp definitions are in things like math, logic, computer science. Like if you give the definition of a function in computer science, that's got a real good definition, a real formal definition. So in formal systems, you get actual definitions that are neither too broad nor too narrow. But that's pretty much it. Pretty much the only place in life that you'll find them, sadly. But we can get closer or further away, though. Right. So having said that, we're on to the last topic here, analytic and synthetic statements. And all of that should make you worry at least a little bit about this distinction I'm going to give you, but it's still a rough and ready distinction. You can still tell what words mean. Despite all this stuff that I've just said to you, you can totally tell when somebody's using a word completely wrong and when they're not using it completely wrong. So there's still a difference between analytic statements, so a statement or a sentence or a proposition, which is true just on the basis of the words that are in it. Like the meaning, if you understand the meaning of the words in that statement, then you can tell that it's true. And a synthetic statement is one which is not true just in the meaning of the word. So most things that you say are going to be synthetic. Like it is gray outside. You can't tell just by the words "it is gray outside" that it is in fact gray outside. You have to turn your head and look at the window, right? So that's a synthetic statement because it's the facts of matter in the world that makes it either true or false, whereas an analytic statement is one that's true just on the basis of the meaning of its words. Okay? So here's our absolutely classic analytic statements. Bachelor is an unmarried man. This is the standard example for analytic statements. So if you know what a bachelor is, you know he's unmarried and he's a man. Yeah?
If we added like another premise and a conclusion and a kind of syllogism, would that also be analytic?
Yes. Yes. So if we said bachelor is an unmarried man, James is a bachelor, therefore James is an unmarried man, that whole thing would be an analytic statement. It would be a deductively valid syllogism, in fact. Now, okay. Similarly, water is H2O. We've seen how that's like if you understand the word water and you understand H2O and you don't mean a spa in Mississauga somewhere, what you know is that that's true. Right? You should just, on the basis of knowing those words, know that that's true. That makes it an analytic statement. Triangles have three sides. Now, if you define triangle as an object with three sides, you will be disappointed because this blackboard here also has three sides. In addition, it has a fourth side. Right? So just saying that it has three sides is not enough to make something a triangle. However, it is true that triangles have three sides is true by definition. Yeah? And at sea level, water boils at 100 C. That's actually, so that's how we defined what 100 Celsius means. So 100 Celsius was defined by the boiling point of water at sea level. Right? Yeah? Okay. Synthetic statements. There are more mice than tigers in the world. I mean, it's obvious. And if you know anything about mice and tigers, you should accept this. Right? It's not a controversial statement. It's not a statement that you should have much doubt about. but it's also not a statement that you know is true just on the basis of the meaning of those words. Right? Just knowing what a mouse is and knowing what a tiger is doesn't tell you that there's more mice than tigers. Yeah?
Are these the same as a priori and posteriori?
Ah, okay. So are these the same as a priori and a posteriori? Another deep philosophical question. So a priori means something that you know before experience, and a posteriori means something that you know after experience. And for most of the 20th century, philosophers thought that those two things always go together. So there's only such thing as the, okay, blackboard time. So analytic and synthetic and a priori and a posteriori. So these are things that you can know without having experienced anything, just by thinking about it. And these are things that you can only find out by investigating the world. None of this is on the test, by the way. This is just philosophy stuff that I can't resist talking about. So for most of the 20th century, philosophers thought there were only two kinds of knowledge: analytic a priori and synthetic a posteriori. And these are weird, unconceivable things. These things cannot be. Immanuel Kant made a case for synthetic a priori propositions. He thought that you could learn new things just by thinking about it sometimes. So things that are not contained in the meaning of the words can nonetheless be learned by rational reflection. The empiricists hated this idea. And more recently, there's a guy called Saul Kripke who thinks that you can learn analytic a posteriori truths. So his example was the morning star is identical with the evening star. So for a lot of history, people talked about the morning star and the evening star. They were both just Venus. So you can see Venus on the horizon in the morning and the night. And we figured out that they were the same star, right? So this is a fact about the meaning of these terms, the morning star and the evening star. They're identical. Those things are equivalent. So it's a fact about the meaning of these terms, but we figured it out a posteriori. Right? We figured it out by doing astronomy, not by just reflecting on the meaning of those terms. So, kind of. So they're not exactly the same. These are about the meaning of the terms, like whether it's true based on meaning, and these are about what method you used for learning about it. These are the ones. Analytic a posteriori is what you're likely to find. Synthetic a posteriori, analytic a priori and synthetic a posteriori are like the main ones. And these are like, maybe, kind of, possibly. There's debate about these. There's serious debate about both of these. Less debate about this one. Kripke kind of is famous to have shown that there are analytic a posteriori statements, and it blew everyone's mind and changed philosophy forever and all, blah, blah, blah. So. But that's not on the test, so don't worry about it. Or come take philosophy. Yes, come do a philosophy degree and you'll learn all about it. Hooray. Yeah.
To figure out if a statement is analytic or synthetic, if we assume the negation of the statement and ask if it's either a falsehood or a contradiction, could one come to figure out if it is analytic or synthetic?
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. So there is no logical contradiction in saying there are more tigers than mice in the world. That's not a logical contradiction. Like you didn't say something that's obviously and clearly false based on the meaning of the term, right? Similarly, the speed limit on the 401 is 100 kilometers. If you negate that, if you say the speed limit on the 401 is 105 kilometers, you haven't made a logical contradiction, right? You said something that's false. It happens to be false, but it's not like a logical contradiction. Similarly, it's raining outside right now. That's a synthetic proposition. It's a synthetic statement because there's no logical contradiction in imagining its opposite. And inflation was less than 3% last year. Again, to know whether that's true or false, you have to check. You have to go out into the world and check. All right? So let's do this. Let's do a couple of examples. Analytic or synthetic? All ophthalmologists are doctors. Is that analytic or synthetic?
No, analytic.
I don't know what an ophthalmologist is. Does anybody know what an ophthalmologist is? A kind of doctor, I think. Yeah.
It's for the eyes.
An eye doctor. Yeah.
That's optometrist.
What? Okay. Somebody Google.
Ophthalmologist do surgery on the eye, the optometrist checks the eye.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So an ophthalmologist is somebody who you go to get surgery performed on your eyeballs, or to get a diagnosis of what's up with your eyeballs. The optometrist is the nice person that tells you what glasses to wear. Okay. So with that in mind, analytic or synthetic? Analytic. We gave it away when we said eye doctor. Doctor is contained in the meaning of ophthalmologist, right? So an ophthalmologist is a type of doctor, and if you know that, then you know that ophthalmologists are doctors. Yeah?
What if you have someone that performs the same operation but is not a doctor?
Then they should not be called an ophthalmologist. They should be called an unlicensed eye surgeon. Yeah. Okay. Analytic or synthetic? Universities are good places to meet new friends. Synthetic? I don't know. I spent most of my undergrad horribly alienated. I didn't meet very many people at all because I was an argument jerk. But yeah. Yeah. Okay. People who run move their bodies. Analytic or synthetic? Analytic. If you know what running is, you know that it involves moving of your body. There's nothing that's running that isn't moving your body. Therefore, people who run move their bodies. Yeah?
What if you're a mental runner?
A mental runner.
You mentally run away from things.
This would be a metaphorical sense of running, I would imagine. You're emotionally or socially running away from things. Yeah, so in a non-literal sense, we could say that's true, yeah. It's a good question because the literal and the non-literal are not as easy to distinguish as you might like sometimes. But in this case, I would say in a literal sense, this is synthetic, or it's analytic. Maybe in a non-literal sense, it's synthetic. Does that satisfy? Okay, good. Okay, but we'll stick to the literal. We'll stick to the literal. We're trying to be nitpicky here. We're trying to be optimally nitpicky, so it's better to stick to the literal when we can. Right, 4 + 4 = 8. Analytic or synthetic? Oh, you're breaking Kant's heart. Kant thought that was synthetic because you could understand the 4 without understanding that 4 + 4 = 8. You can understand 8 without understanding. So he thought arithmetic was synthetic. I think everybody thinks this is analytic. So he thought it was synthetic a priori, just like geometry. He thought geometry was also synthetic a priori. So this is one of those crazy deep debates in philosophy about whether you learn new things from mathematics or whether you're just learning the meaning of your concepts. This won't be on the test, once again. Our sun is quite average in our galaxy. Synthetic. You don't know that until you've looked at other stars in our galaxy. Okay, good. So other than the one that looked the easiest, 4 + 4 = 8, you seem to all take this quite in stride. You seem to totally get this.